Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the cardiac cycle phases and their effect on the heart, atrial pressure, how they are recorded on the ECG, and if they produce any heart sounds. So we're going to start with the first cardiac cycle phase, which is the atrial systole. The atrial systole, which is the end of the ventricular diastole, produces an effect on the heart, which is during the atrial systole, the atriums contract and tops of the volume in the ventricle with only a small amount of blood. Atrial contraction is complete before the ventricles begin to contract. So before ventricles start contracting, the atrium contraction is complete. For the atrial pressure, for the atrial systole, it produces the A wave, which occurs when the atrium contracts, increasing the atrial pressure, which is in yellow color in the graph that we see, and the blood arriving at the heart cannot enter the atrium, so it flows back to the jugular vein, causing the first discernible wave in the jugular venous pulse. Atrial pressure drops when the atria stop contracting. For the ECG, the atrial systole forms an impulse arising from the sinoatrial node, resulting in depolarization and contraction of the atria. The P wave is due to this atrial depolarization. The PR segment is electrically quiet as the depolarization proceeds to the atrioventricular node. This brief pause before contraction allows the ventricles to fill completely with the blood. For the heart sounds of the atrial systole, it produces the fourth heart sound, which is abnormal and is associated with the end of atrial emptying after the atrial contraction. It occurs with hypertrophic, congestive heart failure and massive pulmonary embolism or tricuspid competence. The second phase in the cardiac cycle that we're going to be talking about is the isovolumetric contraction, which is the beginning of the systole. It affects the heart by the atrioventricular valves by closing at the beginning of this phase. So the atrioventricular valves close in the beginning of this phase. Electrically, ventricular systole is defined as the interval between the QRS complex and the end of the T wave. So it's called the QT interval. Mechanically, ventricular systole is defined as the interval between the closing of the atrioventricular valves and the opening of the semilunar valves, which is the aortic and the pulmonary valves. Now for the pressure and volumes of the isovolumetric contraction. The atrioventricular valves close when the pressure in the ventricles, which are in red in the graph that we see, exceeds the pressure in the atria, which is in yellow. As the ventricles contract isovolumetrically, their volume does not change. It stays the same, which is in white color as we see. The pressure inside increases, approaching the pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, which is in green color. For the ECG, the isovolumetric contraction forms an electrical impulse propagation from the atrioventricular node through the His bundle and the Purkinje system to allow the ventricles to contract from the apex of the heart towards the base. The QRX complex is due to ventricular depolarization, and it marks for the beginning of the ventricle systole. It is so large that it masks the underlying atrial repolarization signal. Now for the heart sounds. The first heart sound, which is the lop sound, is due to the closing of the atrioventricular valves and associated blood turbulences.